All right, well, once again, ACSC family and alumni and supporters, anybody watching this, we are doing yet another installment in our summer interview series, and this time I'm with Tom Mundie. Some of you might recognize that name, but especially current students, the easy way to understand who Tom is that he's April Click's dad. And so he's had a very interesting life, and what we're talking to him about, and when you are watching this video, or at least when this video is released, we're going to release it the week of July 4th, and the reason is, we are talking to Tom about being a follower of Jesus while also wrestling, kind of juggling with what it means to be a citizen of the U.S., what it means to be patriotic, just how does nationalism and patriotism mix in with our faith. And as we talk about that, because of Tom's background in the military, we'll also be diving into topics of Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek, how does that relate to our understandings of the military. I know some of you have family members who have served in the military. Some of you are planning to go into the military. So we're going to be all over the place with those topics, hopefully in a coherent way. But just helping all of us think through those topics. I know Tom is a very intelligent and thoughtful person, and I wanted to get his thoughts on it, and April arranged that for us. So Tom, why don't you just introduce who you are and your background and all that. And
Sure. I was raised in Huntsville, Alabama, and mostly went to Mississippi State University. I was a biochemistry major, and just kind of a broad brush. I went to college on an ROTC scholarship, and once I graduated, I had kind of an untraditional career because I graduated in 1979, which was a few years after the end of the Vietnam War. So the Army was getting smaller during that time, and so they were allowing things that they didn't normally allow. And normally you'd graduate from college, you'd get commissioned into the Army, and you'd immediately go out into active duty.
you were ROTC.
And I was ROTC, right? I had a 4-year ROTC scholarship, and because of my background, I graduated with a degree in biochemistry. The ROTC folks knew that I wanted to eventually go to graduate school. And so they said that there was a program that I could apply to do that before I went on active duty. And so I went, was commissioned into the Army, but immediately put on what they called educational delay. And I went and got my PhD. And so I got a PhD in biomedical research, biomedical science. And once I finished that, then I went on active duty. But now that I had a PhD, the Army didn't necessarily want to put me in positions where I was going to do a lot of rolling around in the mud and doing the kinds of things that normal young junior officers do in the Army. And so I immediately went to Walter Reed, and I did medical research for the Army. And I then did medical research for the Army at Walter Reed, a little bit in San Antonio, and some more in Hawaii. And then I had an opportunity to go to United States Military Academy at West Point to teach biology, because biological sciences was my background. And so I was to go there for 3 or 4 years and then go back into the research and development, the R&D community. But I was offered a position, kind of like a tenured position. It was an academic institution, and they had these small number of positions they called academy professors that were kind of tenured. And essentially they said, if you were selected for one of these positions, you got to stay at West Point essentially for the rest of your career. So we then ended up staying for 13 years. April and her 2 brothers were mostly raised at West Point. We got there when they were upper elementary grades, and we stayed there kind of through in the New York area. And then I retired from the Army in 2006 to take kind of a unique position. Georgia was starting a brand new college from scratch, from zero. And I got selected to be an academic dean at this new college. When I walked in the door, we had no faculty, no students, anything, and we were starting in 3 months.
Oh, wow.
And and it was in the Atlanta area and in Gwinnett County, which was growing really fast. And to make a long story short, from 2006 to 19 when I retired in December of last year. In those 13 years, we went from 0 to 13,000 students.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What's
so
the name of the university?
George Gwinnett College.
Okay, college.
And so that was a real busy time, but it was time to retire. So we retired at the end of the year and moved to the Birmingham area. So I had kind of an untraditional Army career, and it pertains to this discussion because I was in the medical side of the military, which is much more concerned with saving lives than taking lives. And
you never, and I don't know if this is an appropriate question, but you never saw combat?
I never saw combat. I did go to Iraq for a few weeks, and soon after the Army went through and took the country, I and some other West Point professors went to be a part of a kind of a goodwill thing. We went to Baghdad University, taught classes, met students, and tried to engender goodwill of their college people with military officers. I wore my uniform. I had a personal protection detail around me because they were really scared that one of these West Point professors would come and get killed while they were visiting. But I never saw combat. I never served in a combat theater.
So going back to a couple of things. One is, so you technically are like Colonel, Dr. Dean.
Yeah, so I have a PhD. I'm Dr. Mundie. I've been called a lot of things because I was a dean. In an academic environment, a lot of people say it's Dean so-and-so. So I was Dean Mundie. I was Dr. Mundie. I retired as a full colonel, so I was Colonel Mundie. And but I like just Tom. It's just fine.
Okay.
So I'm very informal.
Well, you call me Mr. Cobb.
Yeah. Okay.
So while you were at West Point, my understanding is that I don't know if it was a formal campus ministry or if you just kind of informally worked with some of the students there, but you kind of did campus ministry on the side of being a professor. Yeah,
campus ministry has been a theme and an important part of the life of my family for a while. So, I said I went to Mississippi State, and when I went to Mississippi State, they had an active campus ministry there. Really about the size of the one here at Auburn. And we had a campus minister, and the church was very supportive of the ministry there. I met my soon-to-be wife there. We had our first date in our freshman year. We had a terrible time, mostly because of me, I think. But we were very good friends, and then started dating again like 2 or 3 years later, and ended up getting married. So campus ministry was really important to us. When we went to West Point, one of the things that attracted us there was that we had heard that they had a small ministry there that was led by a family that was supported by a number of churches, I think in Tennessee and all, and they supported them to be at West Point. So when we showed up, we went to the very first meeting, and there was like maybe 6 cadets that were a part of the ministry, and this family, and they pulled us aside the very first week we were there, and they said, "We want to retire, we're leaving in a month. Here's the ministry." So we essentially started, functioning as the campus ministry there, even though we were both, my wife was a teacher, and I was, of course, there teaching and serving. But we ran that ministry, which grew quite a bit. We had 60 or so cadets that were part of the ministry once we left, so it grew quite a bit in the time we were there.
And you were on national TV. I've forgotten this, but right? Because they remodeled the room.
Yeah. April did that. She got us while you were out.
Right, that's right.
So while we were at a retreat, for the ministry. they were remodeling a room in our house and then had this reveal. So yeah,
It's like an HGTV
yeah,
show.
like an
right?
HGTV show that was very popular at the time.
I remember
And
watching
so we that was important. And then of course once our kids got to college age, it was really important for us for them to get keyed into a ministry. And the most important thing for us is we thought about our kids leaving home. So, the Auburn ministry is so important to us because it was a landing place and an important place for April. She met Andrew here. Our oldest son went to the University of Tennessee ministry, met his wife Laura in that ministry. And then our son Jason went to University of Tennessee ministry. Now he just got hired as the campus minister at University of Tennessee. And of course his wife is grew up at Auburn and one of the elders here. So lots of campus ministry ties. I'm very passionate about ministry, campus ministry, not our topic for today.
Right. Well,
passion.
It relates because we were talking before we started that you, and I just made this connection the other day thinking about this interview, that you would have not just taught but ministered to young men and women who would have then been sent to the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And then so you had to be in a counseling perspective of helping these cadets wrestle with what their faith means when they're going to the battlefield.
Absolutely.
To take the lives of other people.
Yeah.
So talk about it for a minute, just from experience of, you were saying before we kind of get started that 9/11, you remember that? And how, just tell that story a little bit.
Yeah, so we were actually at West Point on 9/11, and it was a very surreal kind of experience because when it happened, of course, it was very close. I actually ate in the restaurant, my wife and I, the week before 9/11.
Oh, really?
At the very top, in the restaurant at the very top. When my brother and his wife were visiting New York, and we went in and saw a play, and we were eating at the top. But on 9/11, it was a regular academic day. I was teaching classes, but it was very surreal because the cadets who at that time knew that they were going to go into the military and serve, but we weren't really on a war footing, at that time prior to 9/11. And once 9/11 happened, the looks on the faces of the cadets, you could tell, was different. They knew that their life was changing, and that and war and being deployed and their lives being at risk, possibly taking others' lives, was a real possibility for them. And I think, in terms of the struggle for serving in the military and being a Christian, most of them had answered that question when they decided to come to West Point. We had fewer discussions like that as we did discussions about how they were going to maintain their faith in an up-tempo military environment where they were gone a lot, not able to go to church many times, deployed, their normal religious practices and church attending habits are totally changed, and how they were going to maintain their faith in that kind of environment. And we had really more discussions about that with them than discussions about the morality of being in the military.
Well, on that note, I wanted to ask you earlier, when did you, so were you raised going to church? Were you raised in a Christian family?
Yeah.
So before you entered the military, you would have been seeing yourself as a Jesus follower.
Yeah.
And been serious about your faith.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian family, and my parents both were raised in broken homes. And when they got married, they said, that God and being Jesus followers was going to be the most important thing in raising their kids. I had two brothers and a sister. We were all 1 year apart, so it was like bang, 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 and so we were all close and still are. but church and all was a really important part of my life. I became a Christian when I was baptized when I was 12, and I think that the development of my own faith has been as something that has just slowly, kind of progressed through time. I've never had big epiphanies or big, lapses, I guess, in faith. I've just, but there have been, certain things and parts of my life that have been really key. And I would say the campus ministry experience for me, when I left home, I already had a pretty strong faith. I immediately, became a part of the campus ministry. But the idea of church not being something you go to, but church being something that you are, that you're a part of, that there's this fellowship idea, that you have responsibility and discipleship. All of those were things that really were embedded in me when I started campus ministry. So the idea of faith and all has been important throughout my life.
So when you entered the military, did you have any, was there any kind of soul searching, might be the wrong word, but just, did you have a moment of just wondering if this is a path that Christians should take? Because, historically, right, and in a completely different context, but the first 2 or 3 centuries, Christians were encouraged not to join, right, the Roman military.
Right.
And so it's a question that throughout history, Christians had to wrestle with in every context.
Right. And even in the churches of Christ, it's been, not as much today, but years ago. I mean, I think Lipscomb was a very ardent pacifist.
Mm-hmm. And there was a prominent minister who opposed World War I, who was threatened with imprisonment because of some of the stuff he was writing. So I think in the context I was raised, it wasn't ever a big question. And I think that part of the reason that it wasn't something that was, when I decided that I wanted to pursue the ROTC, which meant I was going into the military, I don't ever remember having a conscious thought about, how does this fit in with my Christian faith? Because in my circles, there wasn't, they didn't have a lot of discussion. We weren't at war at that time. In fact, we were past the Vietnam War. We were during peacetime. And so I didn't think a lot about just the confronting of taking somebody's life, until some years later when I was already in the military and thinking, do I want to stay in and all, and I started thinking more about it, kind of along the way. And that kind of thought pattern didn't happen to me when I was making the initial decision. Right. Well, and I think that particularly in Southern culture, right? I mean, what's it, guns, God, and country, or something
Absolutely.
like this? That there is this connection where faith and patriotism and military and all those things seem to go kind of hand in glove.
Yeah.
But then for a lot of Christians, when you start to think through things and be in encounter with that, I remember, of course, 9/11 happened. I was in 10th grade, or maybe 11th grade. And so when I came to college, getting involved in the campus ministry, we were in I guess the war would have maybe been over, but we were at least still occupying Iraq.
Sure.
And the emotions at the time were so strong that if you questioned whether we should be in the war,
right?
I mean, it was you were basically betraying your country, and a Christian would never do that,
right?
And you just hear stories and things like that. But then a few years after that, I was interning in a campus ministry. I was at Ole Miss, and a friend of mine had joined the reserve, and his unit was activated, and he was lived in the same apartment complex, and he went to church with us. And I remember walking with him right before he got deployed. We were walking our dogs and just talking, and he really wrestled with when he's at war as a Christian, can he kill another person?
Sure.
Not just Jesus says turn the other cheek, so can a Christian kill someone, in war. But also, and this might have, if I recall, this was weighed more heavily upon him.
Yeah.
That he knew where he would spend eternity as a Christian, but he was being called to potentially kill people.
Yeah.
That at the very least he didn't know if they would. So he really, there are a lot of difficult questions surrounding that. So you said later in your career you started wrestling with that.
Yeah.
So what was the shape of that? Like, what gave rise to that? Why was that even a problem for you?
Well, I think it happens as you meet other people who have other kinds of opinions, and then, being my whole life being kind of in intellectual circles, I read things, I talk to people, and if you're a good intellectual, you have an open mind about everything, and you like to listen to contrary opinions. Anybody who likes to read just everything, everybody that agrees with them is really not the way to be.
Right.
And I've always liked to read contrary opinions and people who think differently. And I think that, I didn't hear a lot of the pacifism, but I think that a lot of it started as people started questioning the decisions our nation was making, and then that follows with the decisions of, well, if our nation is not making right decisions, is it moral to be in the military itself and follow decisions of a government that you don't trust, to make good decisions? And I think that part of it causes any Christian in the military to start to think about the relationship of their chosen profession with their faith and making sure that those line up well. But I would say that the piece of taking someone else's life, if you set that aside, which is not to say that's not an important thing, there's a larger issue here that everybody needs to go through to say, my chosen profession or my chosen hobbies or anything that's really important to me in my life, is that, how does that fit in with my faith? I think we all have to come to deal with those kinds of things. And there are certain kinds of professions that I wouldn't want to be a part of, not because there's something inherently wrong with those professions, but I would have problems with those. But I think I came to in myself, satisfied in my own mind that there was no conflict with my military service and being a Christian. But I also have read enough to know that I respect the opinions of people who come to a different conclusion. Because I think that as you read Scripture, you can find sufficient personal justification for making a decision for pacifism or for military service, either way. And so it is a personal decision, and I think that certainly anybody thinking to choose a profession needs to come to grips with that before they make that decision.
Go back to a bigger, because you reframed this away for the moment at least from a question of pacifism, but to a question of even how you're relating to the government that you're serving in the military. Right. But of course, every Christian who's in the U.S. is at least in the country that has the government,
sure.
Or particularly citizens. We're called to be good citizens and whatnot in the U.S. And so, how do you think as a Christian about your relationship to the country? Do you see patriotism as being at odds with being a Jesus follower? Or are there areas that ways that you think you can be patriotic that are okay as a Christian, but other ways you can't?
Yeah.
How do you wrestle with that in your life? I imagine there's a lot of patriotic display in the military.
Yeah.
I've never been in the military.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of patriotism and a lot of pomp and circumstance that goes along with being in the military. It's just part of their traditions and all. And a lot of those traditions are around serving and patriotic in serving your country. I think that there's a lot of facets to this whole idea of patriotism in Christianity, and I think that that patriotism is I think important for us, and particularly for those who serve, because we do take an oath to follow the Constitution of the United States and defend it. But I also would say that there can be a dangerous is probably a too strong a word, but there can be problems, I think, when patriotism is too much infused in the church and what we do. You know, because some churches you can see, you know, American flags flying along with the cross in the sanctuary, and you see, you know, some churches where patriotism and expressions of patriotism are very important to their, you know, to the church family. And I think that the only thing that we kind of have to be careful of is that patriotism with Christianity, that patriotism itself doesn't become like a form of idolatry, you know, as it were, because we don't worship our nation. And you know, I know this has been a discussion. It was a really big discussion, you know, years ago when I was younger, and there was lots of political discussion about school prayer, which has come up again. But you know, this idea that we're a Christian nation, you know, and I think that we certainly have religious liberties, but not necessarily. I wouldn't say personally that we are a Christian nation, because I think that it starts to stray to something a place that we don't want to go.
In a certain sense, you could say that the fact that we're a nation that maybe historically had a lot of Christians doesn't make us a Christian nation.
Right.
But putting that label Christian nation on it can tempt us to idolatry and to seeing our nation as a certain being somewhat connected to our religion in a way that's unhealthy. But you used the phrase earlier that we don't worship our country; it can always become idolatrous. And what are some signs of idolatry? I mean, of that type. I mean, I've certainly seen displays at churches that make me nervous. I've seen churches who have a worship service where there's fireworks, and the flags are coming down, and it makes me nervous personally as a minister that we've gotten a little too, the corporate worship of the church probably shouldn't incorporate too much of kind of paying, what do I want to say, allegiance to the nation, when it should be a lot about paying allegiance to God. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that make me nervous, but how would you start to see idolatry becoming an issue in those circumstances?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to realize is that the church is universal. It is global. And particularly, let's take Auburn. I mean, you have lots of, you probably have students who visit frequently who are not citizens of the United States, right? And so I think sometimes in our churches, making an association between America and Christianity gives a message, I think, to people that somehow that we are the be all end all of Christianity in the world. And this was really evident to me when last summer my wife and I went to Zambia, and on a mission trip, and being with them when they sang, these songs about Africa and Zambia, whatever, and I was thinking, there's a lot of great things happening. The spread of Christianity is just like going on fire in Africa and Asia, with no help from the United States, right? And so I think that I think we need to be careful that we don't link, patriotism with our church too much. I think this happens sometimes. Also, one of the dangers is that people associate patriotism with a certain topic, and there are so many topics that you might associate with patriotism. And let's just say, military service for one. So we hold up military service as being super patriotic. Then what does that say to the pacifist who doesn't, they've got a strong faith as well, which led them to a different conclusion. Is their conclusion unpatriotic? I don't believe so. It's just a different conclusion. And they may serve, people in a completely different way that's also honorable. I think that there's a danger because sometimes we've associated this Christianity with patriotism, and we pigeonholed it so that if somebody doesn't think the way we do on a particular topic, then we might say they're unpatriotic. I think that, certainly we have a lot going on in our world right now, and people questioning government and things like that. And in some ways, to me, somebody who stands up and says, there are things that we are doing, or that our government is doing, or that portions of our government that are doing, that are not following the principles that we laid out as a nation and the way that we treat people, then to me there can be nothing more patriotic than saying, we're not, as a nation, we're questioning the way things are going because I see that it's not, I see, somebody says, I see that we're not treating people the way that our nation was founded to treat people.
Oh, yeah.
And so if I see that people aren't doing that, or there are systemic kinds of problems in that area, questioning that or even protesting that can be a very patriotic thing, because we're saying, I believe in the principles of our nation, of our Constitution. And I don't think in these cases that we're actually doing what we want to do as a nation.
That's interesting. I mean, because if I'm understanding you correctly, part of what you're bringing out is how there can be unhealthy forms of patriotism that blind us to the real patriotic duty.
Yeah. And I'll say in the military, a lot of people think that people who don't know the military, have never been in the military, sometimes can think that military people are kind of automatons. I'm told to go charge that hill, and so I go charge that hill. I don't question anything. But in fact, I've been through a lot of training in the military, having gone all the way through. I actually have a master's in strategic leadership from the Army War College. And in all of these schools that I went through, there's a portion of these schools where you sit down and they ask military people to grapple with these kinds of questions. And so the military doesn't raise automatons, and they want people to think critically about whether things are right or wrong, because a lot of times the things that military people, particularly military leaders like officers, will be exposed to in other countries, they will be exposed to morally gray areas where they have to make critical decisions. And so being able to have them grapple with these kinds of things are important.
So going back to a Christian's duty to, I hate to use the word duty, but a Christian's relationship with its country, his or her country. I mean, you definitely get in say, just the New Testament, that and it's so interesting to me how the New Testament teachings on this is often in the middle ground between where often the extremes we want to go.
Right.
So on the one hand, you might say something like a Christian should always, patriotism and Christianity are just hand in hand, and certainly we've seen forms of that throughout our history.
Right.
But of course, the New Testament never holds that as the standard. That we should just always kind of blindedly just follow what the government says. Very critical at times, particularly in Revelation. But yet we're called to pray for our country's leaders.
Sure.
What's even more remarkable to me is that in Romans 13, Paul says, pay taxes.
Right.
Which is also interesting. We're a country that's founded in somewhat a tax rebellion.
Right.
But Paul says, pay taxes.
Right.
And there's such a strand, I think, of people, particularly amongst elements of American culture that are the most, you might say, patriotic, or might at least wear that more evidently, that also at the same time tends to be closer to to worries about taxes and anti-tax. So it's interesting that there's this middle ground where at the one hand the scriptures can criticize the government, but on the other hand Paul tells Roman citizens who didn't have a vote, no idea of taxation without representation did not exist.
Right.
It doesn't pay taxes. So it seems to me the New Testament is pretty complex to figure out how you exactly relate. So on one hand, you criticize it. On the other hand, you don't have a vote in the government, but Paul says, pay your taxes.
Yeah.
So how would you help Christians think, kind of navigate, and again, this will be released July 4th week, when there's a big patriotic display across a lot of cities. So how would you help us think about our relationship to the culture to the government with that complexity?
Yeah.
What the New Testament says.
Well, I think that the reason that we have a lot of complexity in the New Testament on topics like this is because we see this book and we open this book and we have to realize that when we read the Gospels, they were writing to a certain people about in certain situation, and that situation is completely different than what Paul was saying to the Romans in chapter 13, a completely different situation. The Jews, when they said turn the other cheek, they were under oppression from the Romans who didn't really kept them under their thumb, and so he was trying to give them the tools for how to act when they were under oppression. But Romans 13, you had the church in Rome, and Paul was wanting that church to be accepted in society and people to be accepted, and therefore, so the purposes of things are different, and therefore you're going to hear different things, in the scripture in terms of people's relationship to their government. And I think that we live in a nation that it is really easy for us to honor people who choose to make sacrifices and serve our nation. I mentioned about how we were at West Point during 9/11. I had one couple that actually performed their wedding. They were both cadets and they got married, and they're still both still in active duty right now, which is kind of unusual. A lot of people, how much they were deployed was just really hard for them, and people who thought I'm going to be in for 30 years got out after 5. It was just a very difficult time during that war. Well, they went in during that time, graduated right when it was just hot and heavy. The two of them married. Their first 4 or 5 years of marriage, they were together 18 months.
Wow.
Between one of them being deployed, the other being deployed, and this and that and the other, and their marriage struggled, as you can imagine. There were sacrifices, there are sacrifices that people make. I was mentioning that I had 3 cadets that were in our ministry when we were at West Point who lost their lives in wars. and made the ultimate sacrifice. And I think that we live in a country where it's easy to honor people who make sacrifices. And I think our nation does that well. Not everybody in this world lives in countries where it's easy to honor. But I think we also have to realize that in amongst that patriotism, that we are also not called to blindly accept everything that we hear or that our government does or whatever. That's not patriotism either. It's not patriotism to just totally blindly accept everything. Military officers don't do that. And certainly people who don't have experience in the military don't have to do that either. It reminds me, I was thinking about this story today. It's somewhat related, but we've all heard the story of Jesus cleansing the temple, and a lot of times we think that Jesus did that because he thought that they were defacing the temple in some way. But if you really read the scriptures, it wasn't that at all. There was this accepted practice that the leaders did that oppressed people because they were setting up tables in an area where the Gentiles were allowed to worship. Gentiles weren't allowed to go into the court of the women or the court of the men or even farther in. They had an area, court of the Gentiles, where they could worship God, people who were proselytes. And the tables were set up in that area. And if you read the scriptures that Jesus quotes when he goes in and has a form of protest, right, against a system which oppressed people. And, certainly it was an acceptable form because it was our Lord who did it. It was an acceptable form of protest, as it were, against something systemic that was wrong. And I think that we need to be careful about how we classify what patriotism really is, because there's a lot of forms of patriotism.
This sounds like you're a little bit, and I'm trying to summarize, but I don't want to be overly simplistic, that Christians should at least feel free to honor people, to honor our country, to honor the people who've made the ultimate sacrifice, but we're also called to critically examine our country, and that maybe as Christians we're holding those two things in tension, and you can't overweight one over the other. That's good. Well, so let me go back to a situation, and for the most part it seems like in most of our lives, people watching this, and in my life, we've not been faced with wars like this, but of course we've had wars throughout our country's history where the people that are on the other side are professed Christians. And so how do you think about that? I mean, it's brothers and sisters in Christ, and I'll finish this question in a second, but earlier I was thinking about, you were talking about the dangers of patriotism and how sometimes we, even Christians can reject a pacifist, because their patriotism doesn't match standards and stuff like this. And I thought, one of the ways I was understanding what you're saying is that we've got to be careful about letting our patriotism divide the church, and along lines that Christ never divided it.
Right.
And it made me think about this, that, you think about wars, even just wars,
Sure.
I mean, that Christians were fighting against other Christians. And in some cases, Christians were drafted as a part of their duty as a citizen. And they were fighting against other, in most cases, men who were drafted and fighting for their country. So as a Christian, you almost don't have a choice, really don't have a choice in that circumstance, but you're fighting against people who, so I mean, how, and again, I know these are difficult questions, there's no simplistic thing, but how do you think about those circumstances where as a citizen, and particularly as a person in service to the country, you might be called to acts of violence against other Christians in service of their country?
Right.
How do we...
I think that I've never been in a situation where I had to take somebody's life. I've never been in a situation where I thought I might have to, in a combat environment, or even in a home invasion or anything like that. Even having served in the military for 23 years in all, I would be mortified about the idea of taking somebody else's life, regardless of what I knew about them or not. Even if I had fully assured that person was not a Jesus follower, was a bad person, as we might call him, I still would be mortified about the idea of taking another life. And I think that people who haven't been in the military, but people in the military most are mortified by it as well, and nobody wants to do that, and a lot of people who have had to do it are affected the rest of their life about what they did, even if they were convinced that what they did, that there was nothing morally wrong. I won't say it was right. It's different between saying something's right and something's not morally wrong. And I think people who felt that they weren't, that it wasn't morally wrong, that they still is not something that you want to do.
Right.
And so, but here's the thing. We live in a broken world. I mean, that's clear from the Bible. We live in a broken world, and things like war, and murder, and all those kinds of things are just byproducts of a broken world, and it's not easy for us to navigate that. As Christians, it's something that we all, I think, struggle with, but certainly in this particular case, in terms of taking life, military people don't want to do that, and I think personally, I would never want to do that. I would not. I would be mortified. I think having served in the medical environment, we carried weapons, but it was with the intention that if we ever had to protect our patients, and so there was a clear reason that you might do it, but it's still, if you had to do it, it's still taking the life. It's not an easy thing to think about.
Yeah. Again, not to make it simplistic, but just kind of make sure I'm hearing you correctly, that part of it is just we're in a broken world, and sometimes I hate to say forced, but we're almost forced in situations where we're doing things that, even though not morally wrong, they're not the things that we would choose if we weren't in that, that we wish there were a way we could avoid it.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's
and I think that having read a lot and been in the military and been a part of kind of senior leadership and hearing the way that people think about what our role is in the world, I feel, almost always do I feel good about the motives behind what we've done as military, even in cases where there's been loss of life, that the intention is not for self-gain, but to try to to save lives, ultimately to make the world a better place, which ultimately saves life, or a safer place. And and so I feel good about the reasons. That doesn't make it any easier for the person in the foxhole with the weapon looking at another person. But in terms of what the intentions for why we would do things, I think that our nation is thinking clearly about that. Have we made mistakes? Yes. But a lot of those times we know there are mistakes in retrospect. It's hard to see them when they're, when you're in the middle of them.
This might be a dumb question, but as a person in the military and who's a Jesus follower, of course, I think that even though I know we're in a very polarized time and almost every administration, about half the country doesn't trust them, or more. I think polls, with Congress is like 4 out of 5 Americans
right.
don't think they're doing a good job. But is it that, as a military person and a person of faith, is there a little bit of, you're trusting the country to make the right decision, but your duty is to kind of to do what the country's asking of you, and you're just trusting that kind of, even in the messiness and at the time maybe in gray areas, that you're just trusting that not only that there's grace, but also that
sure.
I don't know how to put this, so it's not even a coherent question, but that as a person of faith, that you're just kind of saying to God, I'm doing the best I can,
right?
And I'm trusting that the officials are making the best decision, even if I don't know how to judge that.
Sure.
Is there an element of that, or
there absolutely is an element to that, because you can't. Every time a military leader says, take that hill, you can't have, 12 guys turn around and say, okay, explain to me the geopolitical, explanation for why we got to take this hill. Right. No, you got to take the hill. And there certainly has to be trust that the people are making decisions in the best interest of the nation and soldiers and the world at large. Is that always true? No, it's not. But I think that for the person in the foxhole making a decision, there is some. You don't have to feel like there's moral ambiguity, because you're making a decision in the best faith you can that other people are making a moral decision.
That it strikes me it's a hard line, right?
It is.
Because I do think, particularly in the kind of Southern culture I was raised in, and still live in, that there is we have such a high view of our country that we trust it, and we trust that the decisions it's making or that our leaders are making are by and large good ones, particularly when it comes to the military. But that trust falls off deeply, right, when it comes to other countries. And so
sure.
There's almost a mentality at times that, rightly or wrong, this is not a setup for me to say that's a dumb idea, but there's almost a mentality of, well, our country is trustworthy, it's a nation of mostly Christians or something like this, but other countries, man, we don't know. And
right.
Certainly there's a whole group of countries that we think are bad countries. But almost all of those countries, whether secretly or out in the open, have Christians in them. And so if you're talking to we won't name a specific country because we might have international students watching this, right? But if you were talking to if you were talking to a brother or sister in Christ in another country that is not predominantly Christian, and so they don't have the same level of maybe trust that we historically have had here, that they're people who are broadly operating within a Christian framework, so forth, so on. How would you help them think about, should they join the military if they don't trust the government,
right.
That kind of
sure.
situation? I know that's a tough
Yeah,
question.
and I think that I would tell anybody from the country that if they don't have trust in the moral decisions made by their leaders, that they shouldn't serve in the military. I mean, but I would say the same thing for somebody who's saying, do I want to take this job over here, right, in this company? And if they think that what that company does is morally questionable, then you might not want to take that job, And so it's obviously I don't want to minimize the idea of the military and the idea of carrying a weapon and all that being different than being a computer programmer in some job, but the principle applies. I think that it's true that all Christians, when they're put in situations, don't want to subject themselves to put themselves under the authority of something that violates their ultimate authority to God and Jesus as Lord.
Yeah.
And I think that that's and that would apply to military. It would apply to anything.
That's interesting. I mean, that you're, I keep pressing you about specific cases about the military, but it is, you keep reframing it, interestingly, as that's just a question for anybody's vocation.
Absolutely.
So, so I mean, just that even though there is I guess there's a weightiness to be in the military because, the elders never going to tell me to go take a hill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So there is that weightiness that might add to the need for serious deliberation, but every job needs.
Well, it's interesting, but I would say that in some ways, because of a lot of what's going on right now, people are thinking in that way about law enforcement.
Oh, right.
The idea that the purpose of law enforcement is to serve and protect, right? But can things go wrong? And there also have people who have a weapon, so those are not questions limited to the military in that way as well. Those moral questions in terms of what's right and all, and about the way that you treat people.
That's good because I mean you're calling all of us, not just people concerned in the military, to deeper reflection and just to enter into the complexities of what's your job going to require, what's it going to ask of you, what are different circumstances. I think here, because a lot of our students are engineering majors. I remember I have a friend who, out of college, got an engineering job and really wrestled with, because he was working in, I think, research related to missiles, and really got concerned about, well, I'm helping develop weapons that I don't know how they're going to be used.
Sure.
In 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and what, and one of the lines that he drew personally, even as an engineer, was when he was comfortable working on defense systems, but not more offensive systems.
And I would also say too that as I talk to cadets who would go in theater and come back and talk to them, one of the things that they often talk about, other than the fact that it was just difficult time for their faith when they're deployed. But one of the things that often they talk about is the idea that what they were doing was helping the oppressed, which is a very Christian concept, right? Jesus was all about helping the oppressed. And I think, when they went to Afghanistan, they in the context of fighting these certain group of people, they felt that they were helping these oppressed people who've been oppressed for generations by people coming in to their country. The same when I went to Iraq and talked to some of the college students there, and the way that they would talk about the oppression under Saddam Hussein. And so this idea that I know that military people, when they go, particularly when they're Christian, really identify with that idea of the mission being helping oppressed people, even if what they're doing ultimately is offensive. They see it as defending oppressed people, and in that way they can come to moral grips with what they're doing.
That's good. Well, again, I appreciate your time, and I know I'm taking up a lot of your time, but one more question to kind of bring home and kind of pressing you on something we talked about earlier, which is you've mentioned several times pacifism and all that, and obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but I think a lot of people, when they are studying, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, and you get to where Jesus says, turn the other cheek, someone slaps you, and trying to wrestle with, well, what all does that apply to?
Yeah.
And all the cases. And so some people, I've had friends that have gone from gun-toting, I'll fight you at the drop of a hat, to I'm a pacifist because of Jesus, And obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but I should also say I have friends that reached the opposite conclusion, that being a responsible father and a husband means the willingness to defend against attack. So, and I know I'm not asking you to give the authoritative, like if you disagree with Colonel, Dr. Dean, Tom Mundie, then Jesus is not going to accept you. But how have you throughout, not only as a military person, but as a husband, as just a citizen, wrestled with Jesus' teaching to turn the other cheek in the whole context of use of force, self-defense, military, law enforcement, all that. So, easy question.
Easy question. And I think that I would say that I continue to struggle with most of what's written in the Sermon on the Mount in terms of applying it in my own life, and saying, do I allow somebody to take advantage of me, or do I allow somebody to take advantage of somebody else, and I'm saying nothing, or if somebody is oppressive to me, in what way do I can I defend myself or whatever. I tend to view that particular passage as very personal. When somebody is doing something against me personally, and to me, the application of that passage to me is another extension of grace, because when a person is oppressive to you, what they deserve is reciprocal oppression. That's what they deserve. But grace says, I'm going to give you what you don't deserve, right? But I find that passage not to be as applicable on larger scales, like nations on nations and things like that. Because you don't find that application even in the scripture when you see the history of the Jews, when you see the John the Baptist interacting with a soldier, what did he say? Is be just, act justly. He didn't say stop doing what you're doing, because it's a violation of Christian principles. So, I tend to apply that passage more personally to when people with one-on-one interactions than more global things like what we're talking about in terms of pacifism and what nations should do. But that's just me personally right now. You ask me next week, I may change my mind.
It's hard. We have a student, I won't say his name, but I don't think it would, he would even mind talking about it, but that he is going to enter the military, and he came and asked these questions, and remember just talking through these things, and it is, you look at Romans 13, and Paul says that the state's been given, in that instance, the Roman government,
they have authority
for it's just a sword, so it seems like some kind of justice enforcing that using them to the sword seems to have some kind of force behind it. And I mean, one of the definitions of government is it's the monopolizer of the use of force. And so you can see that as well, even there in the New Testament, we see that tension that Paul is saying, well, the government has the use of force, but Jesus has turned the cheek. So there is a tension there, and to my knowledge of Scripture, I would agree with you that there is no application of the turn the other cheek to the levels higher than the personal. So that's good.
But even on the personal level, it's not easy. I mean, it's as simple as going in the store and somebody is ugly to you, and and I think that many times our based response is just to give it back to them, but not easy, it's very difficult.
Well, I think all that we've talked about has been very difficult, and I appreciate you chatting with me for a little over than an hour about all these topics, and very insightful and helpful. Are there any resources, just as students who might be thinking through these things, thinking through patriotism, nationalism, being a Jesus follower, violence, nonviolence, and maybe even geared towards students who might be considering entering the military, that you would recommend to them?
I don't have anything specifically that I can, think of, and that I've read in terms of books or anything that I would recommend. I mean, I think my one piece of advice always, I think we were talking about this earlier, but is to read varying opinions. And, so I would encourage anybody who's going to serve in the military to read about pacifism and read about the arguments from people who say that they wouldn't do that. And because I think that it's good for us to, God gave us a discerning brain, and He wants us to use that to grapple with difficult topics. And this is a difficult topic, and I think that people should just read various things. But I don't have anything specific that I would say point people to.
Good. Well, Colonel Dr. Dean Mundie, it's been great having you. Thank you for taking the time
You bet.
to talk to us.
I enjoyed it.